Conservative Pandemic Principles. Hi, I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle now. And Bill, I thought it would be good to take a few moments out of the breaking headline news of the day and just reflect a little bit on what we may have learned and what we should be thinking about going forward if the principles that we share, the conservatism that most of our viewers enjoy and spread around the world, how well those are holding up in light of this pandemic crisis, and what we can look forward to or how we should approach things going forward based on those principles. And I wrote a quick short list here that you can add to as we go along, but things that occurred to me that are conservative principles that may touch upon what we're dealing with right now. And they are as follows: fiscal prudence, limited government, lower taxes, less regulation, federalism, constitutional textualism, and a strong defense. Now, there are more, I'm sure, that we can add to that, but do you understand what I'm asking here? And what do you think you'd like to take on first as far as it? Okay.
Let's just go down. We'll just go down the list and go as fast as we can.
First one was fiscal prudence.
I maintain my belief that that federal spending is out of control. And it's been out of control for my entire life. That most of the federal budget, 2/3 of it, is basically entitlements, and that number is way too high. And that entitlements keep people dependent on the government. I think that's a bad thing. As far as the pandemic goes, I think this kind of emergency spending is exactly why we have a government. I'd be much happier if that government was running a surplus for exactly this kind of emergency, a rainy day fund. But with that said, if the government is going to shut down people's businesses, or at least make it clear that this wasn't the smart thing to do, then I don't see any moral, ethical problem with taking government money in order to restart the economy that was artificially shut down. It's not propping up companies that should be failing. I have some concerns about major concerns about certain companies taking bailout money because they refuse to sell stock options, or it'll help them buy up more stocks. All of that said, but as a remedy to the American people in times of national emergency, I think the spending bill in general was appropriate. I would just like to make sure that virtually all of it goes to the American people.
Now, the next one is kind of related to that fiscal prudence in a sense, and that is limited government. But it's not only about spending. It's the idea that the federal government should be limited to certain enumerated responsibilities and not get out behind, out of the box, so-called, that it was originally packaged in. How are we doing with limited government, and what would you like to see going forward?
We saw, I think, a pretty good, and in fact, quite a remarkably good example of the power of federalism by having the federal government basically say that this is going to be a decision made by each governor. I think everybody can agree it's fairly ridiculous to apply the same restrictions to New York City as you do to Wyoming, for example. And I think the power of federalism is that it allows the people of each region, of each state, to basically make a decision on their own on how much risk they want to take based on what their particular demographics are and what their susceptibility to the virus is. So as a general rule, I think this is going to come out as a big victory for federalism, especially if the numbers come in considerably what the mainstream media was bleating about in the early days, in which case it will be the purpose of the mainstream media narrative to say that the president had nothing to do with it and that it was all due to the actions of the governors.
I could have sworn you said mainstream media.
Well, it's not much difference these days. So
now you kind of jumped down the list, but maybe I'm making a distinction where there is none, because you went right to federalism, which was further down my list. But specifically what I wanted to know about was the idea of limited government on the federal level, not really the division among the levels of government, but really, the role of the federal government and staying within that box.
The single great moment in the 2020 pandemic, in my opinion, will be looked at as very early in the pandemic, when Donald Trump basically made an appearance with the presidents of Target, Walmart, and so on, and said that testing would be made available not at the DMV and not at a health clinic and not a question of going down to the government agency, that private sector retailers who had enormous capacity for moving people, huge parking lots just for no other reason, would be a place where testing would be made available. And from that moment, the private sector has simply just kicked in a way I haven't seen in a long, long time. So when President Trump decided to make this problem a private sector solution, or at the very, very least, have it included in the solution. I think that is responsible for virtually all of the good that's come out of this and continues to come out of it. And furthermore, it has given all of us an example of what the power of free markets are able to do if ridiculous regulations were moved out of the way, as they were in the case of this emergency. If we had followed the rules laid down by the bureaucracies in the FDA, we'd be seeing an awful lot more people dying. And I credit President Trump for basically saying, we're going to back the government off on this. We're going to relax all of these restrictions, and we're going to start learning as we save lives rather than learning in test tubes. I think it was a very profoundly good decision to roll back the federal govment regulations.
So you made a connection there that I hadn't really thought of, which is, I'm asking about limited government. You're talking about free markets. And it seems like that those work hand in glove, don't they?
There will always, in this society, as long as it's recognizably American, there will always be some sort of balance, some sort of ratio rather, between how much the government does and how much the private sector does. As with all real conservatives, I am not a person who thinks that there should be no government and no laws. I just don't like a big state. And as I said, I'd like a government that fits back in the box it originally came in. In this particular case, I think the private sector could have done even more, but it is a very good example of the fact that this president, based on his background and based on the people that elected him, decided to get the private sector to handle as many of the problems as they possibly could, to be coordinated by some degree by the federal government. And that, to me, is nearly pitch perfect response in an emergency. As I said about the regulations, what it teaches us is, my God, what could we accomplish if we were to roll back the ridiculous regulations and just keep the important ones? Where would we be then, my Lord?
So one of those, and these are all kind of tied into each other. You really can't take one without the other. It's a holistic view of governance, I think, when you look at conservatism. The other is lower taxes. And right now we're actually kind of seeing a backwash of the swimming pool filter, in the sense that the stuff that has accumulated, some of that is now being kicked back out to the taxpayers, including individuals. I got a text from my son this morning that said he and his wife had just received their $1,200 check from the federal government, and also making available low interest loans or forgivable loans. Right. How do you think going forward we're going to be able to deal with it? Because we're going to have a lot of extra debt that has been taken on in the course of doing this. How do you even make the case for lower taxes going forward?
Well, first of all, as I said, I think the emergency spending was necessary, and I would have much preferred a government that was fiscally responsible and had a surplus for a rainy day fund and paid it out of that and then repaid it. But that ship's long sailed, so there it is. The issue of adding to the debt, when the debt gets, look, Scott, I don't know what the point was, but when you get to $2 or $3 trillion, everybody knows it's not going to be repaid. It's what now, 27, 28? To some degree, my attitude towards this was put it on the tab. But to be honest with you, in terms of the repayment of the money that the government has spent, I think we just bill China. There's no question whatsoever that they are criminally culpable for this, if for no other reason than the 6 weeks of lying and cover-ups and so on. So to some degree, the amount of new debt that we've incurred, I think we simply take it on, or just take it off their tab. With regard to—
So not pay them for the T-bills that they've already purchased.
Well, take them to court, present the evidence that this virus was, in my opinion, manufactured, but even that's irrelevant. Present them with the evidence that they lied to the world, that they refused to allow independent medical teams into the country as they were required by international law, by treaties that they signed that stipulated after the SARS outbreak of 2003 and 4, which was also launched by the Chinese, by accident, presumably, that they signed a treaty obligation with the rest of the world that said that in the event of any kind of new disease, they will immediately notify international health organizations and immediately allow external inspectors in to start to get a handle on this virus. If they had acted 2 or 3 weeks earlier, in other words, if they'd only lied for 3 weeks and then told the truth 3 weeks earlier, they say that we could have reduced the effect of this pandemic by 95%. So there is no question at all, none, that in a court of law, it can be proven absolutely conclusively that China is criminally negligent for their handling of this outbreak. And since they're criminally negligent, you can go after them for damages. And the damages in the case of this particular case of lying on the part of the Communist Party of China is in the trillions and trillions of dollars.
Okay, we're going to make this the last question today. And
Sure.
Several of your answers made me think of this question after you started answering. And that is that it seems to me that every time conservative principles bump up against the actual government of the United States of America and real life situations into which we get ourselves or find ourselves, that those principles need to be taken down a peg or two consistently. And it makes me wonder whether conservatism is kind of a utopian ideal that can never be fulfilled, that's just an aspirational goal, and that in fact we're going to spend the rest of our lives trying to chip away to get there, but we never will really get to see it in its full flower in governance. It's just not possible.
Well, that's a contradiction in terms, Scott. The essence of conservatism is that people are not perfectible, neither is government, neither is society. The entire principle of conservatism, as I understand it, is that there are timeless principles that we must do our very best to adhere to, but being made out of clay with serious defects in character that are caused by the construction of the human body and the human soul, people will attempt to do things in order to gain money and power and a bunch of other things as well, mostly power and influence over other people. To say that we're never going to get to a state of perfect virtue is to completely ignore the entire reality of the conservative idea, which is, of course, we will never get to a state of perfect virtue. Achieving a state of perfect virtue is the goal of the progressives. And when that state of perfect virtue doesn't arrive, then it's time to start executing the people who are standing in the way of perfect virtue. And we know where that goes. Our government is predicated on the idea that people are fallible, that people will try to gain power, and predicated on the belief that human nature has some serious defects in it. And that road leads to Disneyland. The road of perfect people and perfect societies lead to either concentration camps or gulags. So to say that we will never achieve the conservative ideal of a world of perfect virtue is to completely misunderstand the conservative ideal in the first place. Our goal as conservatives is to produce the best world that we can produce here on earth. And the best world means maximum human happiness. And maximum human happiness means the maximum ability to do what you want, so long as you're not interfering with somebody else's ability to do what they want. It's that simple. And to say that this is some sort of theoretical ideal that sits on a hill, and if we diverge this much off the hill because of an emergency, that somehow the whole thing is ruined, is not only unrealistic, it's utopian. And conservatism is the answer to utopianism. It's the refutation, it's the rebuttal of utopianism. It's the understanding that these things happen, that things go wrong, and that we have to push the rock up the hill every single day. To those people who feel that we've lost liberties during this lockdown, there's no question that we did during it as a temporary national emergency. If we don't get them back when the emergency ends, and I mean quickly, then we have an entirely different argument to make. But for people to voluntarily stay at home, and they did, they may have been threatened, but there was no teeth in this. You can count on both hands and both feet the number of cases, individual cases of egregious, ridiculous, insane, tyrannical overreach. And those cases are being investigated by the Department of Justice. So the idea that there's this perfect idea of conservatism that is now besmirched somehow, to me, doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Perfection is not only possible, it's the enemy of the good. And the only thing we can accomplish on earth is the best possible society in the face of all of our failings and errors and judgment and so on, and try to improve in the future. And that's been the history of America, learning from its mistakes and improving in the future. And I think we've learned an awful lot from this pandemic, and I am utterly convinced we're going to come out of it much freer than we were when we went into it.
If you'd like to delve into these ideas more deeply, there are two things you can do. Number one is to become a member here at BillWhittle.com, where you can not only get full access to even the exclusive content that is locked out from the rest of the world, or locked down from the rest of the world, but you also get to interact with people who share these ideas, with people who are learning and growing and interacting and encouraging one another. They're the members at BillWhittle.com, and we invite you to become one of them today by going to BillWhittle.com and clicking that Become a Member link. The second thing you can do is you can get a a Patriot's Primer on American Liberty made available by our friends at the Patriot Post. They're actually going to give you two things here. They're giving you the free Patriot's Primer on American Liberty to get you to sign up for the free email list, where they're going to send you daily updates of conservative thinkers and, frankly, conservative humor that you're really going to enjoy. So do both of those. We'll provide links in the description below. For Bill Whittle.
And clicking the link on the Patriot Post and just clicking that for that download, it helps us financially. So it's definitely a way to pitch in if that thought has ever crossed your mind.
Absolutely. And we hope that that thought crosses your mind with regularity. I'm Scott Ott. For Bill Whittle, thanks for watching. Take care.